Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about progressivism, but we're going to talk about Wilson. The last couple of chapters we talked about Roosevelt, and a little bit in the last lesson we talked about President Taft. So today we're going to talk about Wilson, and let's start with the election of 1912. Look at this first slide. So Theodore Roosevelt was progressive. Remember, he's a progressive. Taft is also progressive. But in the United States, the way the elections work is each party, the Democrats and Republicans, they can choose one person to run for president. But because Taft and Roosevelt are both Republicans, you can't have both want to be president. And so the Republican Party chooses Taft, and Roosevelt decides he's going to run as a progressive candidate, the same party as William Jennings Bryan. And people asked him, aren't you too old to run for president? Aren't you a little old? He said, no, I'm as fit as a bull moose, a big, huge male moose. I'm fit as a bull moose. And so people called him the bull moose candidate, or the bull moose party. And he ran under something called New Nationalism. So all these political phrases are really important. Wilson runs under something called New Freedom. Now, Roosevelt loses. Another person named Eugene Debs runs for president as a socialist, and he also loses. Woodrow Wilson, who was a Princeton professor and then a Princeton president, runs and he wins. And you can see this election in 1912. It's not even close. But if you look at the number of people who actually voted, then looks like Wilson would have lost the presidency if he'd been running against only one other person. But he's running against two candidates who basically were Republican, who had the same ideas. On the next slide, we see some information about President Wilson, 1912, when he's elected president. His home state is New Jersey. Taft was Ohio. Roosevelt's was New York. Wilson is a Princeton professor and then a Princeton president, and he wanted what he called New Freedom. Now, Wilson creates, and this is important, and these are things that it's way too complicated to talk about in a 10-minute lesson, and so what I want you to do is spend a lot of time in your book on this chapter, because these things today that we're talking about in this lesson are important for understanding the American economy and the American government that we have today. And these are going to be in your chapter. So one thing that he does is creates the Federal Reserve Board in 1913. Now, the Federal Reserve Board controls the American economy. They set something called the reserve rate or reserve requirement, which we'll talk about in economics in a couple of years. They set the interest rate. So if you borrow money from the bank, how much interest do you have to pay the bank? And they also control the money supply. So do they give loans to the government, or do they buy loans from the government? He also creates the FTC. Now, if you've ever heard your parents talk about, or if you have ever talked about the stock market, the FTC controls and regulates the stock market, and that's created in 1914. The Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 also, and this strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act. And Wilson, as a progressive president, brings suit against almost 100 corporations, just like Taft does. So he's very much also a progressive president. Now, in a couple of lessons from now, we're going to talk about some other really progressive ideas that Wilson has, but not in this chapter. On the next slide, we see the Keating-Owens Act, which stopped interstate commerce that was produced by child labor. In other words, if you have children going down into coal mines and they're digging coal, then we can't sell that coal. If it's made in Kentucky, we can't sell it in Tennessee or Missouri, because the Keating-Owens Act law stops child labor commerce. Also passes the Adamson Act, which requires an 8-day workday for railroad workers, and a Workman's Comp Act, which means that if you get hurt on the job and you work for the government, then you get insurance. The government will pay for that. It also appointed a progressive jurist, meaning a Supreme Court justice who was a progressive, kind of progressive outlook to, we say SCOTUS, but SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, means the Supreme Court of the United States. So you're going to see that a lot, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States. No one actually says the word SCOTUS. except maybe in a classroom, like if I say to you. So if you're out on the street and you say SCOTUS, people might not be sure what you mean. But if you say the Supreme Court, they'll know exactly what you mean. And so Louis Brandeis was appointed in 1916. And there were 4 changes to the Constitution under Wilson, and all for the progressive amendments, the progressive changes to the Constitution, all of them happened under Wilson. And we're going to talk much more about those 4 in another lesson. We're not going to kind of dig into those now. And so Wilson was a progressive president, and he comes in and he passes legislation that protects the consumer. He passes, and under his presidency, we have 4 changes to the Constitution. He also busts and brings to suit as many companies as President Taft had. So he's also very much a progressive president. And that's going to do it for this lesson. We'll see you in part 2 in the next lesson. All right. Bye-bye, guys.